Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LCS Week 2 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. I'm incredibly excited to do this video. LCS this year has honestly been relatively fun to watch. I think so far, at least, it's been a lot more fun to watch than last year. It's only really been 2 weeks of the season, but I think a lot of talent influx has come into the league, a lot of young players being promoted, some really strong imports coming in that have made the league a lot more exciting. There was a lot of parity. There are some teams overperforming, some teams underperforming, so a lot of really fun action to cover. But before we jump into week 2, of course, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of this week in the LCS. What was your favorite game? What was your favorite team? What was your least favorite team? What team overperformed, underperformed, you know, etc., etc. I love hearing you guys' opinions down in the comment section below, but let's not waste too much time. Let's go ahead and jump right into the analysis. Of course, if you're new here, we're going game by game, talking about all 10 games that happened in the LCS here in week 2, giving my analysis, a player of the game, a dud of the game, etc., etc., and then at the end of the video, we are going to be going over my updated LCS power rankings after 2 weeks of games. And so let's jump right into it, starting off with day number 1. And kicking off day number 1 was a matchup between two undefeated teams from week 1. We had Counter Logic Gaming taking on Cloud9, and C9 picks up another really big victory. C9 continues to roll. They were really, really good in week 1, specifically the top side. I was really impressed with how they ended up playing the games out, because when you looked at C9 last year, especially during their playoff run where they really started to get things together, where obviously they kind of became the best team in the league over the course of the playoff tournament, I think a lot of that was through playing through bot lane, and that was certainly not how they kicked off the season, which was impressive to me. Replacing your mid laner here with a more, I would say, carry-oriented, aggressive mid laner, as opposed to Jensen last year, who was very willing to play things like the Zillion, like the Orianna, willing to try and enable his jungler. I think Diplex is someone who wants to play the Ahri a tad bit more often, and I think that opens up you playing more aggressive to the top side of the map and for your solo lanes, knowing the fact that Berserker and Sven can be relatively self-sustaining in the bottom lane. They're going to be relevant towards the back half of the game anyways, and so far this season, that has really, really worked out for Cloud9, because Fudge has just been so dominant towards the beginning half of the year, or the beginning part of the year. We're not even halfway through, but the beginning part of the year here. Player of the game's going to go to Fudge. Again, this is his third player of the game in 3 games for Cloud9. He really has been the driving force for the C9 team in basically every game they play. Fudge's Fiora here, obviously very infamous from Worlds, but a really good showing from him. Not only does he pull off the You Should Know Me invade, which is kind of what I'm really starting to pick it up as. We're seeing it kind of take over a lot more, not only in the LPL and the LCK now too as well, but this is like the level 1 invade onto the jungler, really starting to put them behind, really making it difficult for them to actively play the game. And I think that if you can execute it successfully, obviously without being caught, it can be really positive for your team, which is what happened here. Fudge set contracts back so far that Wukong was just permanently behind the Vi in this game, and there really wasn't a lot he could do to catch up. When it doesn't work like it did for You Should Know Me, and the last time he did it, when it starts to get a little predictable, that's when it can become a little bit problematic, but Fudge did a really good job of executing on that, and then he was able to just kind of dominate his lane against Dokka. He was able to snowball the Fiora out of control and just kind of win the game, either in side lanes or in team fights. And that's kind of the thing with Fiora. I see a lot of people complain online about Fioras who group too much in a lot of these team fights, but I think Fiora is almost an underratedly good team fighter, especially in a comp like this where you do have a lot of backline damage already with things like the Caitlyn, with things like the Kalista, all just kind of building together. I think having a Fiora and a Vi that are all diving in, even something like an Ahri that can really pick off somebody, I think is incredibly strong. Obviously, we'll talk about the CLG draft, but they are very much lacking in straight 5v5 damage, or really damage at all, and so Fiora really adds a lot to those situations. Obviously, she's still going to be really good in the side lane, but I think the discretion is up to Fudge for the most part in this game, and I think he absolutely chose a lot of the right decisions, was always in the right place, and was actively making his team better. But credit not only to Fudge, I want to give credit to Blabber as well. Did a really good job of keeping that lead that he was able to generate early on in the jungle, being able to spread that out to the map. Also, credit to Berserker and Sven. Sven's probably in heaven right now. Obviously, we've talked about quite a few role-swapped AD carries to support in the LPL. Players like Wink, players like Jinzhao. Sven is also obviously a former AD carry that gets to play in a meta where he can just play AD carries in the support position. He gets to pull Kalista out here. I bet he didn't expect that when he role swapped to support a year ago, but they really dominated this bot lane. The Caitlyn Kalista just had so much pressure, so much push the entire time, because I'll say it, Poom was just kind of bad in this game. Luger was bad too, but Poom was also just really not all that useful and influential in this game. And so this bot lane really just had a ton of prio and a ton of pressure that they were just able to put on the enemy team. Basically, everywhere on C9 won, and with the exception of mid lane, where it was just kind of even. Like, again, Diplex didn't lose, it was just kind of relatively even. I think Cloud9 just looked pretty solid. As for CLG, definitely not the game that you really wanted to see after a 2-0 week start, but I'm not particularly surprised. They do lack in talent compared to this Cloud9 team, at least on paper. So, you know, a level 1 play going completely wrong. Contracts is kind of a feast or famine player. He's already being set behind super far. He's not going to have a really solid game, and that's kind of what happens here. The Wukong just becomes incredibly useless. I like Wukong as a pick, especially into something like Vi, because you can disengage it relatively easily towards the back half of the game if you have that, you know, backline hyper carry that you need to peel for. Unfortunately, for CLG, you draft kind of this death ball comp of Orianna, Seraphine, Karma, a lot of these enablers, a lot of shields, and you have no damage. Like, you don't actually have someone to enable for the death ball. Like, you have a lot of setup supportive pieces, and then no one really to capitalize on it, and I think that's a little bit frustrating to look at. I think even if Palafox did play relatively well in the mid lane matchup, certainly Orianna's not going to carry this game for you. She's not really a champ right now in the meta that can do that. Seraphine, Karma are usually a bot lane that is designed to play weak side, is designed to be put on an island so that they can be a little bit self-sustaining and get to those late game team fights and help out the rest of the team. Who exactly is going to win you the game once you get to the late game here? Because I don't know. I don't know draft-wise where you're looking at a successful draft or a win here. But for the most part, I think they just kind of got outplayed. Contracts got set behind and was bad in this game. That's why he's done of the game. But Luger and Poom were also quite poor. I thought both of them were really good in week 1, particularly Luger, who was fantastic over their first 2 games in week number 1. You put him on Seraphine duty. I don't really understand this. Again, Luger's kind of been your best player over the past year, in my opinion, and putting him on Seraphine duty just doesn't particularly make a lot of sense to me. But, you know, for CLG outlook-wise, this isn't the worst loss in the world. You're losing to the former champions who are still undefeated. There very much feels like a big 2 in the LCS right now with FlyQuest and Cloud9, and I think losing to either of them isn't exactly the end of the world for pretty much any team right now, and that includes CLG, who really did overperform in week 1, taking down some teams that I don't think a lot of people expected, most notably Evil Geniuses, and so I have a lot of faith that this team is going to be able to bounce back. Hopefully they'll be able to do it later in the week, but not a particularly good showing. Really not a lot of good takeaways from this one for CLG. You're going to be kind of trying to hang on to that week 1 form. As for Cloud9, you continue the ball rolling. Fudge and Blabber continue to look fantastic up on the top side. They continue to be the big power points of the map, and Berserker and Sven continue to be really good in the isolated 2v2, as they probably will be all year long. Cloud9 has very clearly defined the kind of style that they want to play, and it'll be interesting to see if they continue to commit to that the entire year. Moving on to our second game here of day number 1. We already talked about one of the top teams in the league. It's time to talk about the other, as we saw FlyQuest taking on Golden Guardians. This one, a little bit more of a mismatch, although I would say it was a lot closer in terms of actual result. But FlyQuest was able to pick up the win here. They looked really solid. It was kind of a slow game, I would say, overall. But this mostly felt like a 1v1, if I'm being entirely honest, especially towards the back half of the game. This felt like FlyQuest, you know, kind of hoping Prince would do something to win them the game, and Golden Guardians hanging on by a thread, being held up by Gory in the mid lane, who was making his LCS debut, finally getting that visa, being able to come in here for Golden Guardians. It's funny because actually this game was pretty fun to watch. I know it looks like it wouldn't be. It was about 40 minutes and the winning team had 9 kills, but it was pretty interesting. I think sometimes low kill games can be fun, if only because it's a lot of back and forth, a lot of posturing, a lot of really good macro play being done by both teams, and I actually think that was the case in this one. This was a pretty interesting game, but at the end of the day, FlyQuest is just superior in almost every aspect, whether that be mechanics, whether that be macro play. They know where they need to be, and they know what kind of plays they need to make. I think Spica has really stepped up a lot this year. I think Impact is having a fantastic start to the year, probably the best top laner in the league outside of Fudge so far at the beginning of the year, and then how can you not be super impressed with Prince? He is everything that we wanted him to be, and then some. He's going to get player of the game here. Not only was he really good in lane, really just outdueling Stixxay, clearly being better than him. Obviously, I know Lucian Nami is going to be stronger early than Zeri. Lulu, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like Stixxay should have been able to keep up in relative pace with the best AD carry in the region on a champion that loses in lane, but It was that 2-item power spike that really started to impress me for what Prince was able to do in this game. Not only was he super aware of when he needed to go in and that he was kind of the primary damage dealer, the primary carry here for FlyQuest, but he made some really smart plays. I think obviously the one that everybody's going to point to is canceling his recall to sit in the bush and to trap the team, trap Golden Guardians, get that pick on Huhi, and then basically end the game from there. That was an incredibly smart play from Prince that I just don't think a lot of players make, and it really did accelerate the pace of FlyQuest being able to end the game, but he did so much more than that. He was so great in these front-to-back team fights as well, like posturing around players like Spica, players like Impact, players like Winsome, to be able to get into the right spots, to be able to do his damage. He is everything that I think we were promised, and then some. I think the only thing that I would say about Prince that I'm still kind of looking for is this individual lane dominance. A lot of his really big successful plays have come out of lane, and obviously we know Prince can be an incredibly strong laner. That's what he was last year on Live Sandbox. We saw Krako in the jungle on Sandbox, devoting a ton of time into the bot lane, really getting him and Kale ahead on Sandbox. We know that Prince is somebody who is very adept at getting 20, 30 CS leads, even in the LCK. I'd love to see a similar style being played here for FlyQuest. It doesn't feel like Spica wants to fully commit to just funneling Prince in the bot lane, but I think that could be a really good strategy, just to have these games end super quickly, because it does feel like Prince with a lead is basically unstoppable in this region. But like I said, not just Prince. I thought Winsome played really well in this game. He's played really well in service of Ayla, as he's not able to get the visa yet. Winsome has probably earned himself another LCS spot somewhere later in this year, purely off the bat of playing with Prince, and you know, it's fine. I thought Winsome was okay last year, not necessarily someone that was fantastic, but a good player. I think Spica and Impact, like I already said, are basically completely revitalizing their career. The only player that I wanted to see a little bit more out of in this game was Vikla. I don't think he was particularly bad. Nobody on FlyQuest was bad in this game. No one made any major mistakes or anything like that, but I would argue he was the least important of the two mid laners in this game, which is a nice transition over to Golden Guardians, who I actually think played this a lot closer than I expected. I thought this was going to be a pretty big blowout. This is one of the best teams in the league, in my opinion, versus one of the worst teams in the league, in my opinion, and honestly, Golden Guardians held their own. Gory, in particular, was holding that team up by a thread. He played really well on the Azir. He was stopping the push. He was doing a lot of damage in these front-to-back team fights. His ultimates were actually incredibly crucial, and so credit to Gory. He's a good player. I'm a little bit lower on Gory than I think some of the other analysts out there, if only because I wasn't super impressed with his time in the LPL, and even in his time on PSG Talent, I thought he could have done a little bit more in order to drag that team across the finish line. If we're just going off of Nongshim Gory, I actually thought he was really good on Nongshim, really underrated as a player back in the LCK, but it's been a long time since we've seen that version of him. Hopefully you can get the version that you had closer in the PCS rather than what you had in the LPL, where I thought it was pretty much just a complete disaster for him, but he looked really, really good in game number 1. Obviously, he's being rumored as a complete scrim god. Hopefully he can translate that to the stage. I think if him and River can get a good chemistry together, that could be positive. I think Huhi was pretty good in this game as well, but it's kind of hard when you're no flame to Stixay, right? He's just not on the same level as Prince, right? When you have an AD carry who's on Zeri, who really needs to do a lot of this damage in the late game, especially when you have, you know, the best AD carry in the region on the other side, and you know he's going to be able to perform. You need your ADC to step up, and Stixay just wasn't as good as Prince. He's not supposed to be. I'm not going to sit here and say, like, oh, Stixay really underperformed. Like, he should have been able to be on the same level as Prince, but Stixay is just not Prince, right? And so he's going to get my dud of the game here, because I do think if you have a little bit of a better Zeri in a lot of these fights, the game is winnable for Golden Guardians. I just don't think you had that here. I think Licorice has been very poor to start the season, and I think Stixay has also been relatively poor to start the season. So overall for Golden Guardians, some good takeaways. I think you held tough with a really good team in the league. You know, getting your best player back. Let's not say one of. Getting your best player back and actually getting to play with him on stage is a huge win for them, and this team could be a lot better than they were earlier in week number 1. I had them drop down to bottom 2, which obviously we know is bad, not really for spring, but just in general, so hopefully, Golden Guardians can start to be a little bit more competitive now that Gory's back in, but I think that's going to require a lot of the other players stepping up. River, in particular, is going to need to be a lot better than what he has been over the past 6 months if this team wants to be relevant. And then for FlyQuest, obviously, they're fantastic. Prince is fantastic. Impact is really playing at a high level. Spica is playing at a high level. This is all without Ayla as well. I think when this team does end up getting its full roster, it's going to be clear that my ranking for them as the number 1 team in the LCS is certainly not superfluous. It is very, very well deserved. Moving on to our third game here of day number 1. Another interesting one. Kind of a lot of former teammates facing off against each other as we saw Dignitas taking on 100 Thieves. And 100 Thieves picks up the pretty predictable win in this one. Certainly not surprising to me, and I don't think surprising to a lot of other people as well. They looked really good in this. 100 Thieves have just been relatively consistent, I would say, over their first 3 games. We kind of know what we're going to get from this team at this point. A lot of the question marks that I had about the team and their playstyle going into the year, I think, have been relatively answered. We have a good idea of where they want to put a lot of their resources, how they want to end up playing. A lot of these high-resource players have kind of shown themselves to move in one direction or the other. One thing I said particularly about 100 Thieves moving into the year was I was concerned that Tenacity in the top lane was going to have to take a big role cut. He was someone who took a lot of resources and a lot of jungle pressure in Academy and basically through his entire time coming up through the NA ecosystem. And I was concerned that, putting him on tank duty and just kind of putting him on weak side was going to be a problem for him and for 100 Thieves. It was going to limit his growth. It was going to limit his upside as a top lane player. And while I do think that has kind of become the case, I do think he's played this weak side role a lot better than maybe I was going to give him credit for. He's actually been really solid in this role, and it's allowed Doublelift to really be acclimated quicker, I would say, back to the LCS. Given a lot of resources, given a lot of attention, this was something that I kind of expected to happen for 100 Thieves. Doublelift has never really played anything other than a proactive style and a heavy resource style, in his League of Legends career, and that certainly continues over here on 100 Thieves. He's going to be my player of the game on Zeri. You end up hitting a point where even though you've dominated lane, you're just so far ahead that no one can touch you, like in any space, as long as you kite out well, as long as you position well. When you're that far ahead on a champion like Zeri that has so much mobility, so much escapability, so many ways to actively keep you alive in a lot of these fights, there's really not a lot that the enemy team can do. And quite frankly, Doublelift and Busio were the better bot lane by leaps and miles here. I'll talk about Spawn in a bit, but I'm certainly starting to get an idea of where Spawn is sitting in the AD carry rankings in North America, but really good game from Doublelift. He continues kind of this really hot start that I think is really important for 100 Thieves to have given him. I'm not saying he hasn't earned it. I'm not saying he's not playing well, but I think 100 Thieves definitely knew the style that they wanted to play going into the year, which was making sure that Doublelift felt super comfortable coming back to pro. I think one of the big question marks for me for this team and whether or not they could have been a top team in the league was whether or not Doublelift was going to be as good as he was, in his prime, or the last time he really was at the top of the league, on Team Liquid. And I think investing as much into him as they have over the past few weeks, the first couple of games here, I think has certainly eased that transition in. I think giving him a lot of these carries, letting him kind of find his footing, giving him a lot of the resources, I think has been really positive. It'll be interesting to see if they switch up styles the further they go into the season, because I do want to see a bit of carry Tenacity this season. I think it would be a little bit of a shame if Tenacity was just kind of on a weak side like he has been over the first few games. Yes, he's, played a little bit aggressive up on the top side, but for the most part in draft and in responsibility, he's been given a lot of weak side duty. He's just been taking 1v1s. I think this Ornn game kind of exemplifies that. Closer continues to be incredibly aggressive. I don't think he's particularly meshed well with a lot of the other players on the team so far, but that's pretty easy to rectify. And then Bjergsen's Bjergsen. He's going to be fine. And so as long as Doublelift, I think, continues to move forward and continues to kind of get back to that form in the bot lane, I think 100 Thieves is going to be a pretty solid team like they are here. As for Dignitas, it is not looking good. I understand that they've really only played decent teams up until this point. They haven't really played anybody that I would consider not in like the top 5 or 6 teams. CLG is probably their weakest opponent so far, but that really does say a lot for their schedule, so I don't want to hit the panic button entirely just yet. I want to see what happens when they start playing teams like Immortals and Golden Guardians and things like that, but for now, it's not looking good. Basically, all of these veterans that were brought in that I was worried about meshing playstyle-wise have certainly failed to mesh playstyle-wise. You're seeing Santorin, you're seeing Jensen, players who just aren't carry players, people who aren't, necessarily wanting all the resources, players that don't want to take control of the game, kind of being forced to do so because the other players on the team just aren't stepping up. Armad's not really going to be that in this meta right now. He's not really all that dominant in the top lane, especially if you're going into something like an Ornn. It's going to be hard to carry from that top side. And quite frankly, Spawn is just not good enough at this level in order to do that. Spawn's going to get my dead of the game again. That's 3 in a row, all 3 losses for Dignitas. I want to talk about this when it comes to Spawn because I'm very high on Spawn as a player, or at least I was when he was in Academy. I thought he was incredibly underrated for Dignitas Academy, a big part of that team's success and somebody who was really looking fantastic in that role, but he really very well just could be one of those guys that is really good at the academy level, but isn't quite good enough to make that LCS jump. There have been a lot of AD carries that have fallen into that category. Obviously, in recent memory, we can think of players like Lost and players like King, who have really dominated at the academy level, but just aren't necessarily good enough to be top-tier LCS starters. I don't want to say that Spawn is definitely in that category yet, but I'm getting closer and closer to believing that as we go further on in the season. I know a lot of people are going to put the blame entirely on Spawn for this Dignitas team underperforming, and yes, he got bodied in lane here on a pick that it was unfair to give it to him because Prince just had an absolute masterclass in the Lucian. To go from that to having to, watch Spawn play it, I feel bad. It was never going to look nearly as pretty, but for Spawn in general, I think he can be a decent player at this level. The rest of the team is just not really putting it around him. He's not been very good in lane, and he's really never had the chance to get to late game because the rest of the team is also not winning. And so perhaps in a different situation, he would look a little bit different, but that's not the situation we find ourselves in. As bad as Spawn has been, he's certainly not the only problem that this team has. Obviously, they still don't have their support here. Biofrost is playing, but in my opinion, Biofrost might just be the better player. He might just be better than Ignar. So to see this team struggling so much right now is certainly worrying. I think outlook-wise, looking at Jensen and Santorin as the duo, you are really hoping that their talent was going to lift this team up, was going to let players like Arma and Spawn look a little bit better than maybe they would on other teams. That is just not the case. They are not the carry-oriented players that are actively going to make the team better, and now I am starting to get worried about Dignitas. This very much looks like a bottom 3, potentially bottom 2 team in the league right now. They are just not good basically on any level, and I don't really see a lot of ways for that to improve unless either Santorin or Jensen just kind of clicks and they really get into that zone where they're carrying games and being these big power points early on and generating leads for the team, which neither have really done in the last few years, or if Spawn, suddenly turns that corner, neither of which I think is all that likely. And so for now, I'm actually getting a little bit worried, and I would probably jump the gun a bit on Dignitas being a team that could compete for top 6. But for 100 Thieves, this is looking good. You look like a team that is right in that top 4, top 3 kind of mix, right up there with a lot of the other good teams. I still have question marks about this team. I want to see Closer kind of integrate himself with a lot of the members of the roster a little bit more seamlessly. I want to see what happens when Doublelift and Busio lose lane, because the only time that they've lost lane, they lost the game, and that's something that I think is going to be interesting to continue to watch. Obviously, they've looked good in lane, which is good, but playing from behind is not something that I particularly expect this team to be good at. And I want to see Tenacity get a little bit more of a shot up on the top side. I really do think he could be a really good carry player at the NA level. Not sure how much we're going to see of that this year, though. But overall, for 100 Thieves, a lot of options, a lot of opportunities. I think they're kind of, slowly falling into what we all kind of wanted to see from them as the season started, and I think that's definitely represented by their 2-1 record. Jumping into our 4th game here of day number 1. We had a battle between 2 winless teams in week number 1 as we saw Immortals taking on Team Liquid. And TL does pick up their first win of the year. This would have been an absolute disaster if they weren't able to win this game, but they were, and they looked pretty good in doing so. Now, not everybody on the team looked good, but we'll get to that in a second. Let's talk about the parts that are working for TL right now, which is, quite frankly, this bottom lane. Very impressive performance from Yan. This is somebody who I've been incredibly high on for quite a long time. I know, people kind of look at the Yan Ayla bot lane on TLA as kind of the Ayla show, and Yan just kind of got propped up a bit because of that. You kind of heard that narrative talked about a lot going into the year, and you even heard that narrative talked about quite a bit in Academy from, not only people outside of Academy, but even people in Academy, right? A lot of people were talking about how Yan was just someone who was kind of propped up by Ayla, but when you look at the skill and the precision that Yan plays with when he is playing well, it is right up there with almost any other AD carry prospect that we have seen come out of Academy in a very long time. And in my opinion, you just need to be able to kind of concentrate that. You need to be able to get that out of him more consistently. If you're able to do that, he very well could be a top AD carry in North America. And that's kind of what we saw in this game for Team Liquid. He looked phenomenal on this Lucian, enough where he's easily my choice for player of the game here. If he continues to play like this all year long, I mean, this TL team is actually going to be very, very interesting to watch because they're going to be kind of maybe as good as we expected them to be, but not in the way that we expected them to be. We were talking about Harry and Yan and, that side potentially needing a little bit more time to get used to the league, and that Summit and Pioshik should be able to kind of handle the transition a little bit easier. It's kind of been the opposite for TL. Jan has really stepped up and looked good. Obviously, credit to Core JJ for helping him out with that a lot. I think Core has done a really good job of adapting a lot better to the meta this season than he did last season, where I think he really struggled to play some enchanters at the beginning of summer of last year, but slowly but surely, I think as the season went on, he got more comfortable on the enchanter role, the less roam playstyle, the more inherent 2v2 in lane playstyle, and I think he's going into 2023 looking a lot better. That's the reason I had him ranked as the #1 support in North America going into the season, because it felt like he really was going to show up and be that this year, and I think he has looked really good so far, and he's made Jan look a lot better. I don't want to say he's the only one making Jan look good, but he has made Jan look a lot better anyway. So this bot lane continues to be good. Harry continues to be good. This is Pioshik's probably most consistent performance of the year, even though I don't think he necessarily did a whole lot in this game. He wasn't actively running down the game for his team, which I think is a plus from what he was in week #1. However, we do have to talk about Summit a bit. Summit just got completely outplayed in this game, and that is not the first time that has happened this season in this split. Summit is really starting to concern me up in the top lane. He was very hit or miss for FPX. He was given a ton of resources for them when he joined them in the LPL last year. As soon as he joined the team, he immediately became the lane that they wanted to play through, and a lot of times that helped them. A lot of times it did not help them. He comes back over here to the LCS, and that Feast or Famine playstyle has absolutely carried over. I don't actually think he's been very good over the first couple of games. I think he's been very much a hindrance and a detriment to this TL team, and if that keeps up, that's going to be problematic. Honestly, Revenge was so much better than him in this game. Yes, and I'll talk about it. Revenge had a lot of resources. He got a lot of ganks from Kenvi, but still, Revenge was so much better than him in this game that you know, it is a little bit worrying. Revenge, as good as he is from ahead, isn't someone that I would consider to be like a top laner. I don't know why I said it like that. A top tier top laner in North America. And so for Summit to just have no pressure on a champion like Renekton into Cassante against Revenge is honestly a very worrying trend. And I think without Jan playing as well as he did this game, TL very easily could have lost it with how much pressure was on topside for Immortals. But overall, they still were able to pick up the win, which is all that really matters in the end. As for Immortals, some good, some bad. This is probably your best performance of the year so far, but the problems that have carried over from week 1 certainly are still there. They're not gone. Like I said, Revenge looked really good in this game. Easily the best performing member of Immortals. Probably the best performance from an Immortals member in 2023 so far. He just dominated Summit in lane. He was able to have more pressure than him out of lane, obviously punishing a lot of those crazy mistakes that Summit made. Kenvi did a really good job of being able to recognize that that lane was going to be very volatile and did a good job pathing up to that side to make sure Revenge had a lot of resources and a lot of opportunities to be able to get that gold lead. Unfortunately for both of them, their bot lane was just not in a position to be able to keep up with Team Liquid. Tactical is going to get dud of the game again here. He was my dud of the week. In week #1, he continues to be a problem here. He just looks completely mental boomed. He makes so many positioning mistakes on champions like Draven, where he just steps up to Illusion and dies so quickly. He gets caught out by Core, he gets caught out by Pioshik. There are so many opportunities for Tactical to just get destroyed, and this is really just kind of a common trend and a theme with him at this point in his career, where he has the mechanical skill we know to be super influential and aggressive and fun to watch in these team fights, but it seems like he's lost that inhibitor that he had when he was on Team Liquid that told him to play safe in the early game to get to the part of the game where he could be that big team fight carry presence. It just seems now he's playing like that all game long, and he's not really doing it with any backup. He doesn't really have any sort of pressure or any sort of reason to be playing like that early, especially on a champion like Draven, so he gets punished incredibly hard for it. It very much feels like that part of the brain that was like, this is not a good idea, is just gone for him, and if that doesn't come back, he is going to be a big negative for Immortals. Obviously, he's going to have some games where he looks really good because of that aggressive playstyle. When he gets a lead, I imagine it's going to look really solid, but I mean, he's going to be behind a lot, and he's been behind in every single game, and it has cost Immortals wins over the course of the year so far. So yeah, I'm definitely worried about Tactical. Fleshy, quite frankly, just seems to be nothing. I have yet to really notice anything about him, good or bad. Tactical is running it. Fleshy does absolutely nothing to save him, but he does absolutely nothing to like help the rest of the team either. This bot lane is quite clearly just the worst in North America by a large margin, and so I don't expect that to change all that much. And Blazolov did nothing on the Kassadin. Overall, there were some positives again for Immortals here, especially with that topside Revenge looking very good this game into Summit. He was by far the better player in the top lane. I thought Kenvi showed a good understanding of where to be on the map, but for for the most part, those two players can only do so much if the bot lane is going to lose as hard as they did. And then for Team Liquid, you really needed this win. You could not afford to go 0-3, dropping another game to Immortals of all teams after you've already lost 2 in week number 1. I think they have to be praising Jan in the post-game kind of meeting that they have, because he played out of his mind. I think him and Core are definitely the 2 strongest members of the team right now, and that says a lot. Summit continues to be a massive problem. Pioshik is incredibly inconsistent. I still don't think that this team is going to be a real contender unless those particular teams turn it, or players, I should say, turn it around. And so I really do think the fate and the hands of Team Liquid are all being rested on the shoulders of Summit and Pioshik, and if they can step up, this team will be good. If they play like this, maybe not so much. Then moving on to our final game of day number 1 here. We had a fun one that I was actually kind of interested to see how it would play out. We had the undefeated TSM taking on the 1-1 Evil Geniuses, and EG was, in fact, able to take the win here. TSM had really started off super hot, and honestly were looking a lot better than I was expecting them to in week number 1. So I was a little bit concerned for EG, who definitely struggled out of the gate, but they definitely got a little bit of their form back in this game and in this week in general, which we'll talk about here. But for Evil Geniuses, it really did look exactly how you wanted it to. Now, it wasn't perfect. Jojo continues with his little tactical hints that he has sometimes here, especially on this Rise champion, where he just, man, he has some plays that make you spam ping the question mark. But for the most part, it was still fine. He created so much pressure on that pick that a lot of the other players on this team had so many opportunities to just kind of win the game for them, most notably FBI. Now, I've talked about this a bit. I don't want to go too hard into this discussion, but I got a ton of comments in my LCS power rankings and player rankings video that FBI replacing Danny was not going to be positive for Evil Geniuses, that they were really going to struggle, that FBI was certainly not going to fill those shoes, that he was washed and not, you know, an AD carry that can be trusted at a high level. I'm not an I told you so kind of channel, but this is FBI, right? This is who he is. I know, obviously, we can talk about him not having the best of regular seasons last year, but even then, he was at worst like top 3 AD carry in the region last year, and even then that was considered like a down split. I still think he is one of the more talented ADCs in the entire region, and he showed it in this game where genuinely he played fantastic. His positioning was perfect. His aggressiveness was absolutely there. He did really good in lane. He knew his win condition. If he was able to generate that lead early, he knew he was going to be able to transition that into a ton of damage late, and there was absolutely nothing this TSM comp could do to stop him, and that's exactly what happened, is he got so far ahead and really started to snowball the game out of control that there was basically nothing TSM could do. So a very easy choice for player of the game. That's his second of the year already for FBI. He has integrated himself incredibly well into this Evil Geniuses roster, and I think that's only going to get better. Him and Vulcan seem to have a very good duo chemistry together. You know, I'm not going to say that's FBI. That's really a Vulcan thing. It feels like every ADC that Vulcan ends up playing with feels better and plays better because they get the chance to play with Vulcan. And so FBI kind of joining that club isn't particularly surprising. Vulcan's just a really good player. However, I do want to say that FBI is looking really good, and his mechanics are definitely on display right now. This very much feels like 2019, 2020 in particular FBI, where we kind of looked at him as, he's okay in the team fights. He can sometimes miss position, sometimes be in the wrong spots, but his laning was so unreal back in 2020, especially in that playoff run for Golden Guardians. It kind of fell away as he kind of progressed a little bit further. He kind of switched roles into more of a team fight carry, but I think we're seeing that lane dominant kind of aggressive mentality play style coming back out here on Evil Geniuses, and I think it's working a lot. Another really good game from Someday in the top lane. Inspired in the jungle, looked really good on the Vi, going in on that Draven, making sure that he didn't have the damage to be able to compete with the rest of this team. Overall, I thought EG just looked good. Again, Jojo still continues to be a little bit of a weak link for this roster. I don't think that will last. Jojo is one of those players that just has games where he's not going to look as good, and that just has happened so far to start the year. He wasn't particularly good in week number 1. I don't think he was particularly good in this game either. Was in a lot of situations where he was just not where he needed to be. Luckily for him, he was able to kind of outplay it a bit, bring out a lot of cooldowns and put EG in a position where they could actually counter back somewhere else on the map. But to me, those are plays that should not work against like the best teams in the region. Like, those are plays that are not going to work at the highest level, and that's kind of what I want to see from this Evil Geniuses team. If they want to compete with a team like FlyQuest, or if they want to compete with a team like Cloud9, Jojo can't really be making these plays. Obviously, he's a good enough player to kind of cut down on a lot of these mistakes, but these were the mistakes that we thought he'd cut down on as we got into summer last year, where it felt like he got a lot more consistent as a player as opposed to spring of last year. And so hopefully it just takes a little bit of time for him to get reacclimated to playing on stage and he can get back to the form that he was at in summer. As for TSM, frustrating loss here. It's hard to kind of pinpoint where things went wrong. You're indexing, I guess is the word. You're indexing a lot into Draven in this comp. You've got the Galio, you've got the Cassante, you've got the Wukong. You don't really have a lot of ways to win team fights if Draven is behind. And I think EG recognized that as well. And so both teams kind of indexing a lot into that bot lane. Unfortunately for TSM, EG was just able to do it a little bit better. You were able to get the Vi onto the Draven early. Lucian was able to generate that big lead. And from that point onwards, the game is basically over. You don't really have enough damage to be able to keep up with Lucian in late game team fights, and even if you did, you've got the Vi to shut down your single target threat here in Draven, and so not really a lot of opportunities for you to be able to win the game. I don't think the draft itself is awful. I think there have been worse drafts that have won games in the world this year, but I certainly don't think it's easy to execute, and I certainly don't think it plays to TSM's strengths. I would say that this is a team that definitely benefits more from going late. Players like Maple, players like Solo, players like Chime, I would consider much better team fighters than I would consider them laners, and I think that definitely applies to TSM as a whole, to index very much into a comp that you need to win early against a very good early game team, arguably the best early game team in the entire region. I think is a very risky and ill-advised draft to go for, and so I don't think they did themselves any favors in drafting this game, but I certainly don't think they played it out well either. Unfortunately, Neo is going to get my dud of the game here on the Draven. A lot was put on his shoulders, and he just could not get there. He was kind of shut down really easily early, and from that point onwards, he is useless, and therefore TSM is useless. It wasn't entirely his fault that he was put behind. It wasn't entirely his fault that he wasn't able to carry this game, but it is worth noting that because he wasn't able to carry this game, TSM was not able to win. And so for me, Neo's going to get the dud of the game because he was kind of the focal point and the big shutdown target of Evil Geniuses in this one. I thought Maple also played relatively poorly in the mid lane on the Galio, wasn't actually able to take advantage of a lot of the mistakes that JoJo was making in the mid lane, and that's kind of something that I want to see teams start to do a little bit more aggressively. As much as I like Evil Geniuses, if they're making mistakes, they need to be punished for it so they know not to make those mistakes again, and it didn't feel like a lot of the mistakes that EG was making in this game were particularly punished, and that's just something that I think is worth pointing out. But for TSM overall, not the worst game in the world. Again, you could say that you just lost in draft, you lost in champ select or whatever. I think that's simplifying it just a tad bit too much, but I do think there is value in saying that this draft is not good and very difficult to execute on. And I think looking into the future, hopefully you can find a way to maximize your strengths rather than try to play towards your weaknesses like they did in this one. Obviously, bot lane's not going to be the strength of this team. We never thought it was going to be going into the year. Both Boogie and Maple had very good week number ones, and so I would expect you to want to play through that jungle and mid just a tad bit more, which is not particularly what you did in this game. I don't think protect comps are really all that strong right now, and I think we're seeing that globally. As for Evil Geniuses, this looked good. Outside of JoJo making some positioning and macro errors, I think everybody on this team looked fantastic, especially the bottom lane, which is really looking like one of the best in the entire league right now in a meta where that is incredibly important. I think my hype for Evil Geniuses was absolutely justified going into the year. It'll be interesting to see if JoJo can get on the right page, if this team can compete with FlyQuest and can compete with like Cloud9. I'm not exactly 100% convinced that they're going to be able to do that right now, if only because they do make quite a few mistakes, but they certainly have the talent to do so, and all they really need to do is clean up the small errors, and I definitely think they'll be able to get there. Now we move on to day number 2, and we kicked day 2 off with the match of the week, the one everybody was looking forward to, the top 2 teams in the league going head-to-head, and it wasn't particularly close. We had FlyQuest taking on Cloud9, and FlyQuest looks dominant. They continue their fantastic run of form, cementing themselves as the best team in North America right now. And this game was not close. There really is no other way for me to put it. FlyQuest was so much better than Cloud9 in this one. It is actually disturbing how good they looked. It is a little bit worrying when it comes to Cloud9, but we'll talk about that when we get to them. For FlyQuest, everything is clicking right now for them. This is 5 members of the team looking fantastic in unison, and you don't even have your full 5-man roster yet. I don't even know. Hopefully it'll make it better. I hope it doesn't mess up any sort of chemistry, but Ayla should just be a better version of Winsome, and you're already doing this to the league. It's insane. Every single player on this team has had moments to shine in this year so far. Impact had the early parts of week 1. Prince has really had pretty much every game, and then this time it is Vicla's turn to look absolutely nutty on the Sylas. He's going to be player of the game, a very easy choice here. He just completely outplayed the mid-jungle duo of Cloud9, which is quite impressive if I do say so myself. But once you hit that 2-0 point on Vicla very early on, it must have been like 5 or 6 minutes into the game, it felt over. It felt like the Sylas was just going to completely run and control the map from that point onwards, and guess what? That is exactly what he did. A fantastic performance from him. For the first time this year, it really looks like he is going to be the single best mid in the region. He's looked good, don't get me wrong. He's looked very good, but honestly, of the players on the team so far, he's probably been the least flashy up until this game, but this game absolutely changed that perception. He obliterated Diplex in the mid lane matchup, which is definitely concerning on the side of Cloud9, but this is the superstar that I think FlyQuest really wanted to get when they were bringing Vicla in. I've always been a little bit lower. I would say on Vicla, I had him as around like the 5th or 6th best mid in the LCK, somewhere in that area. I didn't have him as somebody who was like competing for top, 3, top 4 mid in the LCK. I thought he was a good player, maybe not like a global superstar, but this performance really shows that, yeah, he really is leaps and bounds better than a lot of the other mid laners in North America. It's a very weak role in the LCS, and I think that that is being exemplified by Vicla just absolutely dominating here. A really impressive performance from him. Also got to shout out Spica. I got to throw this stat out because I saw it on Reddit, and it's just worth talking about. Spica picks a Mumu jungle in this game. This is a Mumu jungle's 2nd win in a major region since 2015. I mean, that is insane. That is an insane stat to have. I think the other was like Samsung Galaxy versus MVP in the LCK in like 2015, but a really fun game from Spica. You don't see a Mumu jungle very often, but man, were they able to take advantage of the CC layering that Mumu and Sylas and Lux and Cassante are all able to pile on to one member. They were able to trap the Vi a lot. They were able to trap the Akali very consistently, and so a lot of moments in this game where FlyQuest just looks basically unstoppable through the use of their mid-jungle duo. And honestly, those are the two players I really wanted to see step up in this game in particular, because Prince, we know he's been very good. Impact has had a stellar start to the year. It's been Spica and Vicla. Not that they have been bad. They've been fantastic. Spica in particular, I think, has been really, really, really good to start the year, but just not as flashy. I wanted a game where I could look at it and be like, this is the Vicla game. And we got that against Cloud9 here. So another incredibly impressive performance for FlyQuest in this one. But then for Cloud9, definitely a frustrating way to lose. It's not super frustrating that you lose to FlyQuest, because again, to me, they are just so clearly the best team in the LCS right now, certainly the most talented team in the LCS right now. It's not frustrating that you lose. What's frustrating is that you got completely and utterly destroyed, only managing 2 kills the entire game, and even then, both of them were just overextensions from a team that was already super far ahead in the game. Done of the game is going to go to Diplex in the mid lane for me. It just felt like he was so outplayed by Vicla that I understand that his scoreline isn't as bad as Blabber's, but Diplex felt like he was outplayed just a tad bit harder. I think you could realistically give this to Blabber in the jungle as well. Both of those players got severely outplayed by their counterparts in Spica and Vicla, and I think that really just shows you the team cohesion that FlyQuest has as a whole. It really is bringing out the best in all of their players, and unfortunately C9 was just kind of the victims of that here. Diplex is someone who I think is going to be considered the weak link of Cloud9, at least early on into the season here, and unfortunately, he absolutely kind of looked like it here. I think he really hasn't looked all that impressive in their 3 wins up until this point. It's very much been the Fudge and Blabber show in a lot of their wins, with Berserker and Sven consistently winning the 2v2 and Diplex just kind of along for the ride. So to see him finally go up against like very good competition and really not be able to hold his own, it's definitely a little bit disappointing. It's definitely looking like he might be a little bit of a hindrance for this Cloud9 team. Now, obviously, he's got a lot of time to get accustomed and get used to playing with this roster. He is the new member on a team full of cohesive units, so I don't want to sit here in week 2 and, pull the trigger and the panic button and say, oh, he shouldn't be playing, bring Eminus up, who's playing fantastic in Academy. I'm not going to sit here and say that. What I am saying is that right now, Diplex, in my opinion, is playing at a slightly lower level than the rest of Cloud9, and I think as long as he does so, this team's not really going to be competing to be the #1 team in North America. But Blabber also had a bad game. He just has games like this sometimes. He plays super aggressive, especially when he gets a champion like Vi, so he's gonna go in, he's gonna try to make plays. Unfortunately, Vicla and Spica were just better in this series, and they just looked better pretty much the entirety of the game, and so Blabber has one of those games where he looks bad. Fudge gets outplayed by Impact. Berserker and Sven, we were all looking at the Prince versus Berserker matchup. That was what was hyped up. That's what everybody wanted to see, and we end up getting Caitlyn Jhin, probably the most boring matchup, and neither of them really do do anything. That's kind of just how all these fantastic matches that we're all waiting to see play out never really lives up to expectations lane by lane, but FlyQuest is a team that is living up to expectations. Unfortunately for Cloud9, they just weren't able to match. I still think they're a very good team. Losing to FlyQuest isn't a death sentence for a team like this. Hopefully they're able to take this and say, okay, well, we've kind of figured out where exactly we can improve when we play a team like this again, because it did not work this time around, but that doesn't mean that you are dead in the water. This team still has looked fantastic up until this point this year, and it's certainly not the end of Cloud9 to see them lose to FlyQuest like this. It's just a little bit concerning for their chances of winning the split. And then for FlyQuest, I mean, you just look unstoppable right now. There is not a team in the league that I feel confident in they can even go toe-to-toe with FlyQuest, honestly, right now. The talent level that this team is able to offer is just out the roof, and they really are showing it in basically every single game. We were worried that this team, you know, full of imports wasn't exactly going to click early. Maybe it would take some time, especially with Ayla not being in and, you know, maybe the language barrier. Nope, none of that is a problem. Right now, FlyQuest looks as good as any team in the LCS has over the past few years, and if they keep this up, they very well could easily stroll their way into an LCS title. Moving on to our second game here of day number 2. We had another interesting one, a top team facing what seems like a bottom team here, as we had Dignitas taking on Evil Geniuses, and Evil Geniuses definitely proving that they are better than whatever this iteration of Dignitas is right now, because holy crap, are they just not good, like at all. They look completely inept. I know they're playing good teams, but God, this team just has no fight. Evil Geniuses win this game. It's unfortunate that they give up 2 kills right at the end in the fountain, because this was almost a perfect game from EG. Unfortunately, they're not able to hang on. That's the Jojo Pune special. He's not able to get that Azir shuffle in the right direction, so Inspired and FBI end up going down, but EG still ends up dominating and completely destroying Dignitas in this game. A lot to like from the side of Evil Geniuses. This is the team that I was hoping that we were going to see when the year started. This is the team that I ranked number 1 in my preseason power rankings, because when they click, like when a team like this is on, I can't imagine there are a lot of teams in the world that are going to be able to keep up. Obviously, FlyQuest is fantastic, and they're better than maybe I was giving them credit for in the preseason power rankings. Obviously, I had some reservations. I was right to have some, but they've been wiped away. Evil Geniuses could be right up there with them, though, if they can continue to play like this. My player of the game could go to quite a few people, but for me, in this one, it's going to go to Inspired in the jungle. This was just an utter destruction macro-wise from the side of Evil Geniuses, and truly an exceptional performance from being able to get control early and keep control for the entirety of the game, something Inspired does at a super high level. He's not afraid to go for these plays that could potentially gain him large amounts of pressure on the map, and then when they go right, like they did in this game, he just never relinquishes that control. Again, a very fantastic game from Inspired on the champion that I think he really made his signature champion over the course of summer last year in his MVP run in the Sejuani, where it just feels like he has so much unbridled pressure on that champion, where he's going to make plays early as long as his mid laner is willing to roam to plays with them, which, spoiler alert, in this game he absolutely was, and then he's really never going to be punished for it, because Sejuani is incredibly difficult to punish, especially if she's ahead. And so Inspired doing another really good job with another really good game, but credit to Jojo. He was the other one that I was kind of considering here. This jungle mid duo was definitely all over the map. Easily Jojo's best game of the year. However, still some mechanical mistakes, some misplays that maybe would have made some fights easier. I'm nitpicking right now, though, because Jojo was genuinely phenomenal in this one, and this was kind of the mid-jungle duo that you were hoping to get. This was the summer version of Inspired and Jojo. This was not the spring version, which is kind of what we felt like we were getting through the first 3 games. This looked fantastic. Vulcan was everywhere on the map on this Rakan that we're really not seeing be picked up at a high level, because it really is kind of a skill check. If you're good on Rakan and you can get these engages, you're going to be incredibly solid, but if the enemy team can disengage you, that pick is entirely useless, and so Vulcan doing a really good job there, FBI doing his job, Someday doing his job, everybody on EG just kind of dominating. This game was not particularly close. On the side of Dignitas, already talked about it, but this team is bad. Like, there really is no other way to put it. They don't really seem to have any player on the team that's playing well right now. Teams all have the same kind of mentality and the same game plan going into Dignitas, which is, let's focus Jensen for the first 10 minutes of the game, get him behind, and then the game is over. I don't even think Jensen's particularly like a carry-oriented player. He's not someone that I think will kill you, but I think it's been proven on the side of Dignitas that he's really the only one who has a shot, because nobody else on this team is going to do anything. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Armut in the top lane. He accomplished absolutely nothing on Cassante. You gotta love that teleport at Baron to absolutely nothing. It really is just kind of encapsulates, I think, what Dignitas has been going through this year, which is no macro, no micro, no nothing so far. 0-4, and they look like it. They don't look like a good team. I get it. They've been going up against good competition. Evil Geniuses, 100 Thieves, FlyQuest, like they've been playing some of the best teams in the league, but you still gotta look at least relatively competent, and they have not been able to do that in any of their games so far. Arma getting down to the game here, Spawn continuing to look bad. Santorin looked awful in this game, getting completely out-jungled by Inspired after an early, after the early lead went EG's way, and then Jensen and Biofrost didn't really do anything in the game, and so overall, Dignitas just completely looks inept. Like, there's really no other way to put it. They look like they can't really play. They might be this year's version of what Immortals was last year, or what CLG was in 2021, where it's on paper a team full of players who can play the game, but in practice, in concept, they all just become worse by playing together. That very much could be the Dignitas of this year. Obviously, I want to see them play against Immortals, against Golden Guardians. I want to see what this team is able to do. Maybe when they actually are able to generate a lead in the early game, it'll be interesting to see those matchups as they come in the next couple of weeks. But for now, Dignitas looks completely helpless, and they're definitely going to plummet down, I think, a lot of people's power rankings. As for Evil Geniuses, this is the kind of bounce back week 2 that I really wanted to see. They didn't exactly look dominant in week number 1. Like I said earlier, they were making a lot of mistakes even in their wins, and I really needed to see them clean that up. And while they weren't perfect in this game, certainly some misplays, this was about as dominant of a performance you could put on against a team like Dignitas as I could have possibly asked for. This was incredibly fun to watch. This team is incredibly scary, and you know, I know a lot of people have been talking about FlyQuest, and Cloud9 is the big 2 in North America right now. I think Evil Geniuses absolutely deserves to make that a big 3 at the absolute worst. They looked great this week. They looked great in this game in particular, and I expect they will continue to look great for weeks to come. Moving on to our third game here of day number 2. We got an interesting matchup that I'm only going to talk about the game in, just prefacing that before we get into any of this, but the matchup was between TSM and 100 Thieves. On the Rift, this was actually a pretty fun experience. Draft was incredibly fun. It's always great to see Bjergsen's Zilean. It is a classic, and it literally never disappoints. It is always one of the best experiences that we have here in the LCS year in and year out, and that definitely paved its way here against his former longtime org in TSM. Obviously, a couple of TSM players on 100 Thieves here. Bjergsen and Doublelift going against their former team, and 100 Thieves definitely looks like the better team. This was a dominant performance, again, from this team that really dominated game number 1 in the week as well. They looked really solid. Yes, it was against 2 worse teams, I will be entirely honest with you, but 100 Thieves still getting the job done against the teams that they absolutely should be able to beat. That confirms to me that they really are a team that deserves to be in that upper echelon. That was kind of a question at the beginning of the year. Were they going to be top 3? Were they going to be top 4, top 5, top 6? Like, where exactly were they going to fall on kind of the scale? It seems to me they are pretty clearly one of the upper echelon teams. Maybe not on the same path as like FlyQuest, but still a pretty good one. And a lot of that is just due to the fact that they can play through basically any lane. We talked earlier about how Doublelift has been kind of getting a lot of the resources for 100 Thieves on this team, and that Tenacity is someone who's kind of been playing weak side because of it. Well, that was the case again in this game. Let's not say anything else, but you still got Bjergsen in the mid lane, arguably the best player in LCS history here, getting his signature pick in Zilean, and he's still going to style on kids, just like he was doing a decade ago on the champion. And so Bjergsen's going to be getting my player of the game here. It is just so oppressive to have to play into Bjergsen when he is on this champion. Not only is he positioning perfect, not only is he able to get out tons of damage, but that revive is so crucial, the speed up is crucial. He can take a game that feels lost and turn it into a game that feels entirely winnable. It's never out when he has this champion because of the advantage that he's able to give you in a lot of these 5v5 team fights. And so when you're able to generate that big lead in the bot lane anyways, it's over at that point. When you have Zilean on your team and you have a ridiculously fed Zeri, like, the game is just unwinnable at that point for the team that is going into them. And so Bjergsen's going to get my player of the game on the Zilean again, just because he looks so ridiculously good doing it. But Doublelift also deserves a lot of credit. Another fantastic game from him. He really has been great at the beginning of the season. I was really concerned and interested to see how he was going to transition back into playing pro full-time, because he hasn't been playing all that much over the last 2 years. Yes, he's been playing League, but it's not really been at a pro level and a, consistent schedule. Like, he hasn't been grinding out the game in the same way that you have to do when you're a pro, and in the same way that a lot of his opponents had been doing. But his natural skill is just so ridiculously high that after a couple of months back in that grind set, it seems like that he is right back to where he was before the retirement the first time, and so very impressive from him. Busio continues to grow. I think he's getting a little bit more comfortable playing in the LCS. He was stepping up a little bit too much, I think, in some of the early games. It really does feel like he knows his limits a little bit better now. Tenacity's good on weak side. Closer had probably his most cohesive game of the split. Not as many weird plays coming out from him. Just a really nice performance. Overall, 100 Thieves were just like by far the better team in this game, and it definitely showed on the Rift. As for TSM, after a good week one, it really does feel like that was maybe just a little bit of TSM magic starting off the year, because they really faltered a lot this week. Not a good week for TSM at all. They got completely decimated in this game. Obviously, didn't like their draft in game number 1 earlier in the week. This draft is much better. You can certainly win with this. It's a little bit late game indexed. You're going to have some trouble, I think, getting leads in the early game, but for the most part, if you can get that Lucianami online, the Azir is going to help with that. The Maokai is incredibly oppressive to play into. You've got options to be able to win the game. You were just so much worse than 100 Thieves in this game that there really wasn't a lot of opportunities for you to be able to win. Boogie's going to get my dud of the game here. The Maokai is ridiculously easy to pilot into something like the Vi. All you really have to do is pressure her out in the early game, and you should be able to just scale the game out from there, especially with lanes that you're able to kind of force ahead, things like the Lucianami. But not only were you not able to do that against the Vi, you got super far behind in the early game, but your winning lanes and Lucianami in particular lost, and they lost early, and that's just a death sentence. If Zeri Lulu gets ahead of the Lucianami, it is over from that point in the game. That's always been how that bot lane matchup has worked, and that's what happened here. But Boogie had no control of the map. He had absolutely no initiation tools. Every single time that this Maokai went in, he would instantly get blown up, whether it was by the Zeri, whether it was by the Vi, whoever it ended up being. He was just completely useless throughout the entirety of this game. I think a lot of that just has to do with the fact that once you're a tank and you're super far down, you're no longer a tank. You can't actually tank any damage, but going in on these priority targets, setting up pick plays that Maokai really likes to do here, especially with things like Nami Bubble or Gangplank barrels, like, it's so much more difficult when you have Zillion Revive on the other side that you actually have to deal with. It's much more difficult to actually try and get these pick plays, and so Boogie was just trying to force a lot of stuff towards the back half of the game, and it really was not working. Solo was also pretty bad. Chime was bad. Neo got run over in the bot lane. Maple was not nearly on the same level as Bjergsen. It's really hard to pinpoint one exact area where TSM went wrong in this game, because I don't actually think there was one area where TSM went wrong in this game. I think it was every area that went wrong for TSM in this game. I think this just kind of shows more so what we were expecting out of this team at the beginning of the year. They are an okay team. Like, they have some talent, but they're not going to be able to compete with any of the top teams. Week 1 was probably a little bit of a fluke. TL was definitely struggling a lot. Their win over them probably a little bit inflated, and looking at that now, TSM might not actually be, a top 7, top 8 team in the region, although there are a lot of teams struggling right now, and so definitely some things that this TSM team needs to kind of clean up, but I think they're kind of crashing back down to earth and slowly getting back to the mean here in week 2. And then for 100 Thieves, you're looking really solid. I think if you keep this up, if you start to play like this against teams like Evil Geniuses and Cloud9, later in the season, obviously, not, now, because they already lost to them, but if you start to play like this against some of the upper teams, I think you do have a chance of being able to break yourself into that top 3, potentially top 2, situation that is going on in the LCS right now. I do need to see a little bit more diversity from this team. If Doublelift and Busio lose lane, what happens? Again, it's something that concerns me when it comes to 100 Thieves and their ability to consistently be able to win games. It's what I said a lot about Live Sandbox in the LCK last year with Prince and Kale, where it's like, okay, what happens if they don't win? They win a lot, but what happens if they don't? Do you have any backup plan? That team did not. Does 100 Thieves? Do they have a backup plan if Doublelift and Busio are behind? Can you play through Tenacity? Can you play through Closer? Can you play through Bjergsen? I want to see that in terms of resources. That's really the only thing holding me back from calling them a surefire, S-tier team in the LCS right now, because on the Rift, at least against these bottom teams, everything is looking good right now. Moving on to our 4th game of day number 3. Man, this was a game, a pretty low-quality one, if I do say so myself. We had Team Liquid taking on Golden Guardians, and honestly, neither of these teams looking particularly good. Team Liquid definitely looking better, which I'll get to. Man, Golden Guardians has some major issues with some of their players, but it's not like Team Liquid was clean. I don't think clean is a word I could possibly use for Team Liquid in this game, because it certainly was not. I had to give player of the game to somebody, so I gave it to Summit. Now, a little bit of back and forth on this one in my mind. Summit was by far the most impactful member of Team Liquid in this game. That is not really disputable. He had the most good plays by far of anybody on TL. He was leading the game in damage for the entirety of it, and just looked really good in the top lane, obliterated Licorice in the 1v1 in lane, and was relatively able to translate that to teamfights. However, he made some of the worst plays that I've ever seen in the midpoint of this game. That teleport into 5 people only to immediately die is one of the most unreal plays that I have ever watched watching professional League of Legends. There could be no way to explain that. There is no miscommunication or misclick or whatever that I could believe that would be realistic there. I just think that is an inhuman decision. It's an out-of-body decision from Summit to do that. I'm going to ignore it because nobody else on the team was really all that, like, impressive. Like, they were good. Yon and Core were good, but they didn't really do all that much. They just kind of got to late game, and then Xayah eventually did damage. Summit was really the one that was pushing the tempo forward, even if a lot of the times it was actually, you know, hurting Team Liquid. At least he was doing something. So for me, he's going to get player of the game here. Pioshik was better, but again, not super aggressive, just kind of super passive. I think he took his week 1 to heart and ended up playing really, really passive this week. Yon and Core JJ, I think, were good in the late game, which is good, but not necessarily great at generating that lead early. I want to see them stomp lane, especially against Stixxay and Huhi. That did not happen. And Harry made some mistakes. Honestly, Harry was a little bit up and down in this game. Certainly some mispositions from the Sylas. But at the end of the day, TL was able to win. They were able to close out the game. They had such a huge lead. It took them forever to end it, but they eventually got there. They eventually did win the game. As for Golden Guardians, this team just looks bad. I understand that we're high on River and we're high on Gory, and I think River certainly had moments in this game where he looked okay, but God, Licorice is just so bad. Like, he is just so bad right now. He has completely fallen off a cliff. Another dud of the game for Licorice. He is maybe one of the worst players in the LCS right now. Him, Tactical, Spawn, like, these players are just, they look like they're getting gapped so hard at this level that it's almost insane to me that they had played as well as they did in previous splits. But yeah, Licorice has completely fallen off a cliff. This is one of the worst Gragas games I've ever watched in my life. Completely useless, got destroyed in lane, got destroyed out of lane, did literally nothing the entire game. Easily my dud of the game. A bigger storyline here was just how bad he was, if I'm being entirely honest. River had a good game on the Wukong. He absolutely did try his best. This is probably his best game in quite a while. I talked about this a lot last year. River definitely got overhyped, I think, for a majority of 2022. People looked at him and said, like, oh, you know, he was really, really good in spring, and then he was actively losing Dignitas team, that Dignitas team games in summer. He gets traded over to Golden Guardians and doesn't really make the team any better. He's basically the exact same as Pride in that role. You're really hoping that him and Gory can have some synergy, and I think they showed it a bit in this game, but still wasn't really there. Gory was whatever. Stixxay and Huhi were super boring in the bot lane. This really was just Summit running over Licorice in the top lane, being able to generate a ridiculous amount of pressure and gold for Team Liquid, and then them just taking 35 minutes to do something with it. And there's really no other way for me to describe it. Golden Guardians as a whole looks like probably the worst team in the LCS right now. Even with Gory and River being, like, not awful, they have no cohesion, and their weak links are really holding them back from being a team that can at all compete in any of these games, even against a team like Team Liquid that is really struggling and is making massive mistakes most games right now. And so, yeah, Licorice and Stixxay are pretty big hindrances. Licorice in particular, I think, has been incredibly bad on the top side. If they don't fix that, if Licorice doesn't get a little bit more consistent, it doesn't really matter how good River and Gory are in the jungle mid duo. They are going to be a team at the bottom of the standings for the rest of the year. As for Team Liquid, you won a 2-0 week. You bounced back, I guess, but it's not a particularly good-looking 2-0 week. Game number 1, big impressed with Yon and Core JJ. Game number 2, they played well in that same vein. They just really weren't the focal point for the team. Yon and Core definitely look like the bright spot for Team Liquid right now, but man, game number 2, you just needed to close this out so much faster. It is actually insane how slow and methodical and deliberate and boring you made this game after having such a huge lead in the early game. And so, still a lot of things to fix for this Team Liquid squad, but after coming off of an 0-2 week to go 2-0 this week, even if they're not the cleanest games in the world, I think this is definitely a team that's going to take that. That's going to bring us to our final game of the week here in week number 2. And it was an upset. One of the few upsets that we've actually had in the LCS this year. We had Immortals taking on Counter Logic Gaming. And truly Counter Logic, Immortals picks up their first win of the year here. This team has looked completely hopeless in their first few games, looking entirely outmatched in basically every part of the map except for top lane in that one game earlier this week against Team Liquid, but you know what? They put together a pretty solid win here. They were the better team in this one. You got to give a lot of credit to this bot lane that actually did really step up for Immortals. They've been a gigantic anchor on this Immortals team over the first few weeks, few games for Immortals, but they were actually really solid in this one. They get Lucian Nami and they actually play it correctly. They're able to generate an early lead and then transition that into a strong mid game for the team. A lot of these players are getting picks that they are incredibly comfortable on. Most notably, Kenvi on the Kindred. I know we've got Pioshik in the league now, and so we've got a different Kindred one-trick, but let's not forget that Kenvi himself was incredibly proficient on this Kindred pick for many years in Academy. It was very notorious, that's the word I'm looking for. It was very notorious for just being an insta-win for 100 Thieves Academy, and good thing that's kind of carried over into the LCS here. He's got the Azir in the mid, you've got the Cassante for Revenge in the top lane, like kind of everything you wanted, and he executed on it here for Immortals. My player of the game is going to go to Fleshy down in the support position. Those Nami plays were fantastic. He was hitting bubbles. He was keeping Lucian safe. Honestly, Fleshy hasn't been that bad. I think Tactical has been significantly worse than Fleshy, and I think Tactical is the biggest reason why the bot lane is really struggling right now. I was a little bit critical of Fleshy because it felt like he was doing nothing over the course of their first 3 games, but really, at times, as a support, there's only so much you can do when your ADC is mispositioning as bad as Tactical's positioning was over the first few games, and so credit to Fleshy. I think he had a much better game here with the Lucian. He was able to enable him and actually was able to do a lot with the Nami, so he's going to be player of the game. Perhaps he's a player that could actually grow into being a pretty decent support at the LCS level. Haven't really seen it yet. This is a good start, though, for me believing on that train. And another good game for this top side. Revenge and Kenvi, I do think, have a very good synergy together. It feels like that's where Kenvi wants to put a lot of his attention in the early games, up towards the top side, up towards Revenge. It feels like those two players enjoy playing together, and if that's the case, that's perfectly fine. You can absolutely win through top lane in the meta right now, and I think both of these players play well together. Blaze Olive was a lot more consistent in the mid lane. Palafox had an awful game. I think Blaze Olive did a really good job of capitalizing on that, but for the most part, Immortals was just more cohesive and just better in this game. I think Fleshy made some really good plays. I think Tactical made some really good plays, even if he was out of position sometimes. And I think Kenvi and Revenge made some really good plays. So overall, really, really pleased with Immortals. Easily, by far, their best game of the year. It's not even really all that close. As for CLG, on the other hand, definitely a frustrating 0-2 week. This was a team that was actually looking really good after week 1. It felt like because of that cohesion that they were bringing in, all 5 members returning from last year, it felt like they might coast to a pretty easy start to the year, but then they run into a really tough Cloud9 team. It's okay, you know, sometimes you're not going to beat Cloud9, but losing here to Immortals is certainly not the look that you wanted to have in week number 2. My dud of the game is going to go to Contracts, although I think there were 2 major options for this, both Contracts and Palafox. I thought were both pretty horrendous in this game, but Contracts in particular had absolutely no business going full AP Maokai when he was as far down as he was. He basically threw the game away at that point. Not that they were in a position to be able to win, but, you know, some things go right. Immortals, you know, a team that is notorious for mispositioning and messing up. If they make some mistakes, maybe you could get some picks with Maokai, bring yourself back into it, give yourself a tank to kind of give yourself some backline damage. But going full AP here when you already have a Gwen on the team was just so ridiculously useless, and it made Contracts just so pointless in the game that it was a pretty easy choice for me to pick my dud of the game here, although, again, you could give it to Palafox because the Aurelia mechanics were just not there. This is a champion that Palafox is incredibly good at. We've seen him play these melee mids incredibly well. He is, you know, NA's version of Certus and Closer in the LCK and Cream in the LPL, these players that are really good at the melee mids, you know, these more assassin types. Palafox is NA's version of that, but it certainly was not meant to be in this game, as his Aurelia was just not good. It was completely outplayed by Kenvi in most situations, but even then in the late game, he wasn't able to do any damage on anybody before getting completely and utterly blown up. Luger tried his best to carry this game in the back half with some cleanup Zeri kills, but again, there's only so much you can do on the side of CLG, and so outlook-wise, in general for this team, CLG certainly didn't want to lose this game, and going 0-2 this week is definitely a big pause in momentum, I will say. The team is certainly not dead in the water by any means. I feel like top 6 is still entirely achievable for a team like CLG, especially because when you look at like even 5 downwards, they're all kind of not really proving all that much right now. It's really just the top 4 teams in the region that look pretty good. Everybody else has so much to prove when it comes to actively being able to win games at a consistent level. I don't think losing here is the end of your season or the end of your confidence or anything like that. Obviously, you still have a lot of room to be able to push yourself into a position that is really positive for you. But I think what this proves is that CLG may not be the top tier team that some people might think they would be in spring after what their week 1 performance was. They still have some of the major problems that they had towards the back half of summer when they really weren't all that successful in playoffs. This mid-jungle duo really didn't perform all that well, and Luger can only carry so much. I feel like he's been really, really good at the beginning of the year, but the rest of the team really does have to step up. As for Immortals, though, you've got to feel good getting your first win here. There were a lot of teams in the LCS that don't have a win, 2 in particular, after 2 weeks of games. Immortals is not one of them, and that is a very good look. I think Revenge and Kenvi in particular had a very good week for Immortals. They looked really good, even in that game 1 on against Team Liquid, and then they looked good in this one as well, but Tactical and Fleshy really stepping up in order to beat CLG in this one, Fleshy in particular. If he can turn into a pretty good support, I don't think he's ever going to be like a top 4 or 5 support in the region, but if he can be like a playable LCS support, someone the level of Poom on the other side, I think Immortals does have some upset potential in them against some of the worst teams in the league, or the teams that are a little bit more inconsistent. I think my biggest question mark would just be, can Tactical continue this run of form? He still had some positioning errors in this one. He is going to try and make those aggressive plays. When you're winning, it looks good. When you're not, it looks bad. And I think for Immortals, you're going to kind of live and die by that as the season goes on. Just lucky for them, I think in this game, it ended up working out for him. All right, that is going to do it for my LCS Week 2 overview and analysis of all 10 games across both days. Up on the screen right now, you're going to see the updated LCS standings after Week 2. Of course, any ties will just be broken alphabetically, no favoritism here. In the first column on the right, you're going to see the updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. So let's go over the biggest risers, biggest fallers. Not a lot of changes this week. I feel like I was pretty spot on with a lot of my analysis. All of these teams are pretty predictable, and I don't want to make too many sweeping changes early on into the split. Some people are going to want to see C9 fall down a tad bit after their rough week. Maybe EG jumps above them, but for me, they're very close in terms of skill level, and I still trust C9 a tad bit more, so top 3 feel pretty locked in, and then 100 Thieves at 4 feels pretty good. Unfortunately, from 5 down, it's all, relatively speaking, a crapshoot, so I'm just going based off of the teams that I have a better feeling on than the others. This is kind of analyst instinct. I wish I had a more active way to talk about that, but really none of them look all that good right now, so it's kind of difficult to separate them. TL's going to jump up to number 5 while CLG falls to number 6. Rough week for CLG. TL did go 2-0, even though they didn't look all that good. They are going to jump up to number 5 because they have the talent to be able to win these games, and I think their bot lane is pretty strong, even if CLG's bot lane is also strong. I think at least the top side of their map has a little bit more upside. TSM's going to stick at 7, even after an 0-2 week, and then Immortals is going to jump up to number 8. I feel like all 3 of the teams at the bottom 3 all feel very close in terms of skill level, but at least Immortals won a game. Dignitas and Golden Guardians both dropping down to 9 and 10, respectively. My player of the week and my dud of the week, though, for week number 2, my player of the week is going to go, surprisingly, to Doublelift on 100 Thieves. I thought he was the best performing member in the LCS this week. Didn't really have to face the most difficult of competition, but still made the most of his opportunities. Looked really solid in his performances. If he can continue to be a big power point with resources for 100 Thieves, they could be a team that slowly starts to creep up into that top 3. So Doublelift is going to be my player of the week. My dud of the week here in the LCS in week 2 is going to go to Contracts on CLG. A rough week for CLG in total. They really weren't able to keep up with Cloud9 at all, and then losing to Immortals is just an absolute gut punch, especially when he just generally looked like the worst team, and I think Contracts was kind of the encapsulation of that. He has always been an incredibly feast or famine player. That is the reputation that he has, quite frankly, deservedly been able to generate in his time in the LCS. The amount of times he's led the league in deaths at the LCS level is astounding, and this was just one of those famine weeks. It happens with him. I'm not saying he's a bad player, but certainly wasn't a great week for CLG, and certainly wasn't a great week for Contracts. So Contracts is going to be my dud of the week. Doublelift is going to be my player of the week here in week number 2, but that's going to do it. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, go ahead and let me know down in the comments section below. What do you think of my power rankings? Who is too high? Who is too low? Who is your player of the week? And who is your dud of the week? Of course, let me know all of that down in the comments section. If you made it this far, hit the like button. It really does mean a lot for the channel. And of course, if you're new, hit subscribe. I do all the major regions as well as NACL. And so if you're interested in weekly recaps of all 5 of those leagues, hit that subscribe button. I'm doing them, and I'm doing them up. Of course, follow the TikTok, watch the YouTube shorts. You know all the Shazam. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.